All right. Got my pen. I got my reminders done. All right. So to get us set up, I wanted to just do some very brief framing about how I brought those of you together. You're all a part of the ruralorganizing.org network and have engaged with us at some level in the work that we do advocating for progressive policy that benefits rural communities. And that has been pretty broad for the last several years. And as we're looking into next year with an election year and thinking farther down the line, we really want to establish a firmer long-term policy agenda. And so I've organized 6 different roundtable conversations that are organized by topic area to dig into some of the issues that folks who are experts in their field feel like need to be on that rural agenda. And that's how I've brought you all together to talk about education and childcare. I know that is bringing a lot of things together, and I think that over the next months and years, I look forward to teasing apart the details with you all, but this is meant to be sort of a starting place to talk about these issues that are in common. As we embark upon this conversation today, I'm hoping we can bring in 2 themes that we see as really critical to the work we do on every rural issue. And those 2 themes are racial justice and climate resilience. We know that the climate crisis is impacting every aspect of life, and that racial injustice impacts every walk of life in every community. So I'm hoping that we might be able to bring those 2 themes into the conversation. Okay, because we have a couple of folks who are not able to stay with us for very long, I want to jump right in. Dr. Flora, could I ask you to possibly turn the presentation off for just a moment so that we can get through some intros and I can get folks' faces to come on, thank you, while we do the intros, and then we'll jump right into your community capital framework. So just to keep us moving as quickly as possible, I'm gonna call on folks. And maybe I'll start with the folks who work on childcare and early childhood education. I'm hoping you can just introduce yourself and your organization. And then I think we're gonna do the introduction to the issue after Dr. Flora has to go, just because her time is brief. So Anne Hedgepeth, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself first. If you could just give your name, your position, and where you work, and then we'll move right along.
Sure, thanks, Annie. I'm Anne Hedgepeth. I'm the Chief of Policy and Practice at Childcare Aware of America. We're an organization that works across the country to support families and ensure they have access to high quality and affordable childcare in a thriving childcare system.
Thank you so much. And I would go to Sherry next. I did get a message that she's on her way, but she's just getting logged on. So we'll come back to her. She is our second expert on child care policy. I'd like to move to the folks who are in the K through 12 space. Heather, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Heather Dubois-Bournon. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Public Education Network. We're a statewide nonpartisan advocacy coalition that aims to ensure that every student in every public school has the resources and supports they need to thrive, something that our state is not currently providing in an equitable way across all of our districts. Rural districts are particularly ill impacted by the way the state funds public education, but also by a number of other factors that I'm hoping we can touch on in today's call as well. So it's nice to meet you all, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Heather. John, I'd love to hear from you next about your organization and role in the K through 12 advocacy space.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you all. My name is John Glasgow. I am the 2-day-old project director at the Association for Illinois Rural and Small Schools. I was previously at Rural Schools Collaborative for a number of years, which you all may have heard of in one form or another. But AIRS is the statewide affiliate for the National Rural Education Association here in Illinois. So we take sort of a two-pronged approach in what we do. At the state level, we are advocating for the rural voice in Illinois state education spaces, be it the State Board of Education or in the legislature or the governor's office. And then on the ground, we're fostering relationships with local districts and rural places across Illinois to ensure that certain federal funding and state funding goes their way, as well as that they get inclusion on certain projects that we're tasked to do with from time to time, which brings me to it. I'm doing a statewide career technical ed research project that I'll be working with them quite closely on. So again, thank you so much for having me here.
Thanks for being with us, John. Did I hear Sherry join us?
I
think I did.
did. Sorry, I'm delayed. Hi, everyone. Hi,
No
Heather.
problem. I let folks know that you were traveling and that it might take you a few minutes. We're just getting into some very brief introductions. We have a couple folks who have to jump off quickly. So we're just doing sort of name, title, introduction, and sort of how you come to childcare and education work. So I'm wondering if you might jump in and share that with us.
Happy to go. So traveling as in walking through a humongous hotel. I'm currently in St. Louis, Missouri for the National Convening for Local Progress. And as Murphy's Law would have it, one of the sessions I'm helping to facilitate for the Women's Caucus was just before this call, and everyone wanted to gather afterwards and talk about just, their experience. So I had to book it to my room on the 6th floor of this 1,000 room property. So Sherry Jones, and I am currently I reside in the Phoenix metro area, I guess, of Arizona. I'm actually in a rural space in Pinal County. I have a long, resume of how I've come into the early childhood space. So currently, in terms of my direct connection with children, I sit on the Florence Unified School District Governing Board, but my background is over 20 years of experience in early childhood education that got me up to that point. I've had experience with direct care, program management, I was a part of 10 years of part of a national accreditation facilitation project. So I've worked all over Arizona with every type of programmatic provision for childcare. And then I also, before my current position as a development director for Rural Arizona Engagement, I was with the State of Arizona Division of Childcare, so supporting early childhood education professional development for providers through Arizona in compliance with the Child Care Development Block Grant Act. And then additionally, I just took on a consulting position with Arizona State University with the Center for Child Wellbeing. And so I'm helping to support a statewide needs assessment for early childhood education for Arizona childcare providers. And there's a lot of stuff in between that, but I've had a couple decades of work when it comes to childcare. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And then the last grouping I have are folks who are working in rural higher education. So Dr. Lovelace, could you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Annie, for inviting me. I'm Jill Lovelace. I am currently the president of Rural Community College Alliance. I see a couple familiar faces on the call, and my entire career has been in education, but I have 23 years in higher education specifically. And we seek opportunities to work with rural community colleges and making sure they have resources to be successful. We work with a multitude of organizations, both federal agencies and nonprofits, to just get the word out to our members. We have our annual conference coming up in about, a little over a week from now. We will be having, quite a few presentations. And so the work of rural education and rural communities near and dear to my heart. I've always worked for a rural community college. So I'm just happy to be here and hope I can, contribute to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lovelace. And then the last person that I have with us today is Rachel Rush Marlowe. If you could introduce yourself and your organization.
Yes, thanks so much, Annie. So my name is Rachel Rush Marlowe. I'm the founder and executive director of Research Ed. I'll talk about Research Ed in a minute, but I come to Research Ed via the Association of Community College Trustees, where I led their rural portfolio. So we do a lot of work with our CCA. It's great to see you, Dr. Lovelace. And Research Ed is an education policy research group. So we are based in Washington, D.C., but we work nationally, particularly with a lot of rural communities. Our work is student-centered, so we try to do everything informed by the experiences of today's learners, recognizing that those are not the traditional students that many people think of, and focusing on students that have been traditionally underserved by our education system. So students with disabilities, students that are first generation, students from rural communities with racially minoritized backgrounds, and students with intersections of those and other identities. So our work is really focused on both research and technical assistance. We believe that research can be an incredible tool to empower action, both on campuses and classrooms and in Congress, and at the state level as well. And we really believe in the importance of education, increasing and equalizing access to education as kind of the first step in breaking down both historic and ongoing structural barriers to racial and social justice and improving the well-being of all people. And I care very deeply about doing that work in rural communities. I grew up in northern Vermont, went to a one-room schoolhouse, and so rural education is a big part of the work that we do at Research Ed.
Thanks so much for introducing yourself. And I'm pretty sure I reached everyone, but please, raise your hand or be vocal if I missed you. Yeah, I don't want to leave anybody out, except for the Floras, who are coming up next as our to kind of ground us. All right, I'm going to go right there. I know that Dr. Cornelia Flora does not have very much time with us, so I want to give her a chance to introduce herself and her work, and then go ahead and just get us right into the grounding of the community capital framework, because I think that's going to be a really important space to start our conversation. So I'll hand it right over to you, Dr. Flora.
Okay, I'm a sociologist. We live in Ames, Iowa, because we're presumably retired from Iowa State University, although we still do research and teaching. And we've been very interested in early childhood education. We started a cooperative daycare center in our home when we lived in Manhattan, Kansas. And one of our goals was to make sure that men were part of the daycare staff. So we talked a bunch of male students into participating as well as fathers. But anyway, I'm going to show you the community capitals framework, which I think helps us understand exactly why we're doing this and what resources may be there.
Are you able to share your screen smoothly now?
Okay, can you see us? Yes, there we are. Okay.
Perfect.
This is the whole flower, as we call it. In the middle are why that we're bringing the capitals together. One of them is economic security for all, that everyone in a community, particularly rural communities, needs economic security. The second is social inclusion, that everyone needs to be respected, everyone's voice needs to be heard. And the final thing is a healthy ecosystem, which is becomes more and more difficult as climate change progresses. When we look at community capitals, we have 7 of them because we resented the economists only focusing on financial capital because so many other things were important too. It's not that financial capital isn't important, but so we start with natural capital, which is the air, the water, the trees, the flowers, the landscape that hopefully is shared by all. Then we move to cultural capital, which is how people interpret the natural capital. It's in Spanish, cosmovisión. It's how we see the seen connected to the unseen. It's what we think is possible to change and what we think is possible. And this is where early childhood education becomes so important, because people need it in rural communities too, because there are huge needs that are unmet in rural communities. And there's human capital. Those are the skills and abilities of each person in the community. And this is one of the things that early childhood education contributes to, that helps build economic security for all, social inclusion, and a healthy ecosystem. Social capital is the interaction of individuals and groups. It's both bonding of people like yourself and bridging people who aren't like you. And one of the important things with early childhood education is that we create both. That not everyone that goes to the school are alike, and the goal of the school is not to make everyone alike, but to appreciate the skills and abilities each brings. Political capital is the ability of a community to get a collective vision, have its voice heard, and influence the distribution of resources. Economic financial capital, of course, is everyone's favorite. Everybody tends to put everything in terms of financial capital, which we think is a big mistake, but is necessary. So it can be in all the other capitals or controlled by it, or it can be focused on as only a goal for communities. And then what's in the middle is just more, and all the capitals are decreased when that happens. And finally is built capital. That's human infrastructure that is in place to support or sometimes to destroy the other capitals in communities. And all of these are very important for early childhood education. There has to be a place for it. There has to be what we've seen in much of natural capital and early childhood education is getting children out into it, helping them culturally understand it, building their skills and abilities, but appreciating those they bring from home, the social interactions, the power to have voice, and finally, using that voice invest in all of the other capitals. So that very briefly is the capital perspective.
Dr. Flora, thank you so much. And you very graciously connected early childhood education to each of the capitals, which is so helpful. We also have folks in the group who are K through 12 education experts and higher education experts. And I'm curious if there are ways that you can point to those levels of education and their connection to the capitals, particularly in rural communities. How do you see those access to those levels of education playing out in that framework?
It's very important because, and one of the things that we try to emphasize for rural communities in particular is the need for political capital to maintain some sort of political control. One of the terrible things we just did in Iowa, we meaning our government, not necessarily Jen and I, was we decided that we would take the budget for education and give scholarships to private schools for anybody who wanted to do it. We already have underfunded public education, and by moving away this funds, and unfortunately my suspicion is that the people who are using it are already can afford to send their children there, but they're taking money from public schools. So it's our ability to show it's important that public schools get all the resources they need, that their buildings are well maintained, that teachers are well enough paid to want to stay there. And frankly, natural capital is important too. That is, you're in a place where you feel good about going. So those are just a few of the links that I see.
Thank you so much. And I see that Heather's adding some fact data into the chat that will definitely make sure to capture and include in the notes of the conversation if we don't get to it verbally. Dr. Flora, I know that you have a very tight timeline, but also Heather, who just put some information in the chat, does as well. So I'm wondering if you have any last words before we hand it over to her to at least summarize the one challenge to educational equity in rural communities. That's where I want to go next. But Dr.
That's
Flora,
good.
I want to give you the final word.
Thank you. I'm eager for the next part. Sounds good.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Heather, I'd love to hand it over to you because I know you also have a time barrier. I'm wondering if you could share with us just the #1 challenge to educational equity in rural communities that you see from your vantage point. I want to make sure we get that in before you have to leave, and then we'll go to Jan, who hasn't had a chance to say something just yet.
Thank you. I would say that the #1 challenge to rural educational equity in Wisconsin, and I think this trend runs across all the states, is just a sort of systemic disparities in how we fund our public schools. And that is like a multi-pronged, reasons for that, but like that's the biggest umbrella. The problem here in Wisconsin is that our funding formula is just patently unfair. The way that we do school funding here is based on property values, not student needs. And so districts do not have the resources they require to meet the needs of the students that they serve in lots of different categories for lots of different reasons. We also have something called revenue limits, which are kind of arbitrary measures that the state has imposed that determine how much each district is allowed to spend. Those vary widely across the states, and there are many, many rural districts that are spending far below the state average because they have very conservative revenue limits when these were first imposed on us about 40 years ago, but they actually have very high needs, a lot of students in poverty, a lot of English language learners, a lot of kids with disabilities, and so on. And so that's not fair. And then as Dr. Flora has suggested, the disproportionate impact of voucher programs on rural communities are increasingly significant in Wisconsin as more and more state funds are taken away from the general pot of
Heather, we lost that last little bit.
Sorry.
The disproportionate impact. I'm so sorry.
Of privatization on rural communities. Can you hear me?
Maybe
okay.
It might have just been me. But thank you for repeating because I'm trying to record.
Yeah, I was just trying to get the point across that even in rural communities where we may not have a lot of students in the district who are participating in the voucher program, because so much money is being siphoned off the top of education spending at the state level, those impacts have disproportionately impacted districts that don't get a lot of state aid, most of which are rural. So the vast majority of our districts in Wisconsin, we have 421 districts, are rural districts, but most of the students live in the most populous districts. So, like, I think it's like 75% of students are in the top 10 most populous districts, but like 80% of our districts are considered rural. So, there are a lot of disparities here, and those all have very real human impacts in the classroom and in how education is implemented and worked, and have to do with our rural teaching crisis. We also have a major childcare crisis, which I think is directly related to all of these things. And that's further exacerbated by a state that does not invest in childcare supports, and recently in the last budget entirely eliminated our childcare shares program, for example. And so, there's a reciprocal relationship between all of these things. And I'm looking forward to partnering with you all on some practical solutions for ways we can both explain this to people and work toward policy solutions that can get some bipartisan support. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Heather. I know that was a lot in just a couple of minutes, and I know that we're going to have more to do to dig in and, like you said, find ways to collaborate on some solutions and communicating these issues to folks who can stand up and do something about it. I want to step back to the other Dr. Flora and give you a chance to introduce yourself. And I'd like you to add anything you would like about the community capital framework. And then Dr. Flora, feel free to go right into some of the education specific content as it relates to your experience. And then we'll go ahead and get the other guests to share their #1 educational equity challenge. So Dr. Jan Flora, I'll hand it to you.
Dr. Flora, I think you're muted.
There we go. Okay, I have a slideshow,
Do we have?
but I
Oh,
could do
there
it
we go.
with or without it, whichever you think contributes the most to a more informal approach.
I just knew you didn't have a chance to introduce yourself because we were trying to rush so that Dr. Cornelia Flora could go to her next call. So I just wanted to at least give you a chance to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jan Flora, and I am Professor Emeritus from Iowa State, and very much enjoying retirement, even though it's about as much work as it was when I had a job, but I'm doing the things that I enjoy doing. Can you hear, is there some serious background noise, or is that a problem for you? Okay.
Dr. Flora, it sounds okay to me.
Beg your pardon?
Oh, your audio sounds okay to me.
Okay, good. So my work and experiences have been in the area. I'm a sociologist also. Cornelia and I met in graduate school in the same department. And I focused one of my early experiences after completing my sophomore year in college was that I spent a summer in a Mexican village and decided that I wanted to become a community development person. And ultimately, that kind of shifted over to an interest in community organizing. So I'm involved in a industrial areas foundation group in central Iowa called AMOS. And in addition to that, because I grew up on a farm in Kansas, which I wanted to get away from, but it turned out that you don't get away from the experiences that you have in your childhood. So I've been very much involved in sustainable agriculture issues and combining that with the community development part in terms of working in extension with groups that were working on local food systems and things of that sort. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much for giving us some context about how you come to the conversation. All right, I'm going to take a step back. If any of you had taken a look at the sort of rough agenda I set out, I want to go back to the thing I had originally planned to do first, which is to ask each of you to just summarize, as much as you can, the number one challenge to educational equity in rural communities that you see from your vantage point. And again, I mentioned this, Sherry, before you were able to join us. But one of two themes really run through the work we do at ruralorganizing.org Education Fund, which I'm hoping we might be able to bring into this conversation, which are racial equity and climate resilience. And I know that lots of folks incorporate those into education, and I'd love to hear if you see a link to those themes in the educational equity concerns that you have. So how about we start with higher education? Either Dr. Lovelace or Rachel, if either of you want to begin with your perspective on the biggest challenge that you see to educational equity.
Well, I can go, if that's okay with Rachel. I think what keeps coming to mind is access. It's who has access to that illustration of capital. It really is about access to all of that all of those areas of capital, especially information of how they can actually get into higher education. Sometimes that's the hardest. And ironically, it circles back to childcare, because so many students rely heavily on childcare if they want to go back to school. And in rural communities, and this is what we faced where I was working last, or every place that I've worked, there are very few childcare opportunities, and the limitation sometimes for the working poor, if you will, to be able to afford quality care, and as well as time. I mean, often the classes are in the evening, but the childcare closes at 5 or 6. And so just that access point alone is challenging. Access to transportation. Oftentimes, rural communities do not have public transportation. And that is a factor, if you want to look at it also in climate. If we had a reliable, high quality public transportation system, they could arrive at school and take classes that they need. And then finally, another access point is broadband. I know in West Virginia, in particular where I reside, it's a significant issue. There are so many communities where it's going to be a while before they have broadband that can handle online learning, that can handle accessing the resources they need to finish what they've started in college. So I think if you want to increase access, you will increase diversity, you will increase equity, because so many just can't access the support or the resources that they need.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You just so finely put a point on access being linked to so many of the community capitals that Dr. Flora outlined at the beginning. Rachel, what would you add to that conversation?
Yeah, I think that really touches on a lot of the things that come top of mind for me as well. And I love the framing of access kind of as connecting to all of these different issues. I think access is a huge challenge for equity in education, particularly in rural communities. And part of that ties back to all of the things that Dr. Lovelace shared. And another thing I would add is just the geography, right? Like, we can talk all day in circles about what it means to be rural. But geography is clearly a component of that, right? And kind of isolation, small populations, like all of these things that are fairly inherent to rurality make education a challenge. And we know that students from rural communities are less likely to attend college than their peers in urban and suburban communities, even after you account for things like income and high school performance. And we know that by most of the things that we can measure, students in rural high schools are performing as well or better than their peers at urban and suburban high schools, but they're not going to college. And I think that becomes compounded by funding issues, right? I hate to jump in with that so early on. Money's not everything, but it's something. And it won't solve all problems, but it certainly helps, right? And so I think another, major concern that I have is the trend that we're seeing with, defunding public education. Heather touched on in the K-12 space, but also in post-secondary, and in a lot of rural communities, that means mergers and closures. And the research already, tells us that for many students, the biggest determining factor in where they go to school, again, is geography. It's what's within 30 minutes of home. That's where the majority of students end up at college. And so when you already have rural students going to college at lower rates than students from other communities, and then you're shutting the colleges closest to them, that's another major access issue. That's an equity issue for students. And I think it's compounded for students with other, kind of identities that have traditionally not been supported in higher education. Students that are first generation, students of color. People, again, love to think of rural as all white. We know that that's not true. And so I think that there's kind of a number of compounding factors in the access conversation. I think, that the access framing, I just really love, because it also ties to these conversations around climate change. Rural communities, we also know are the most impacted by, kind of climate disaster. We're already seeing it, and many of the things that kind of catastrophic events that people thought were maybe decades off are already happening, and they're happening in rural places first. Students can't get to school because of flooding, because of fires. But I also kind of have great hope there on the flip side of that, and we'll actually be at the RCCA conference in just a week and a half, talking about the potential that rural community colleges have in helping to kind of fight climate change and help stem some of these issues that we have through education and workforce training programs. So I'll stop there because that was a lot.
That was wonderful. And don't be afraid to bring up the thing that matters. So don't be afraid to bring up funding, because we know that it does matter. And we also know that there are inequities in how lots of things are funded based on geography. We see lots of rural disparities in funding. And so bringing that to the forefront when it's important is what we're here for. John, I'd love to turn to you next and ask you to add what you think is the biggest educational equity issue that you might add to what Heather shared with us in the kindergarten through 12th grade space.
Yeah, this I think is probably the hardest question, because how can you distill it down to just one? I really echo, I think, what was said previously. I think a lot of what you're seeing in the higher ed space can be translated down to the challenges in the K-12 space as well. And I think that's what makes it particularly difficult to work in the rural ed sector in terms of advocacy and really trying to fight for things. Because it's not just, my one local school that needs it, but it's all my local schools in my state and my higher eds that are rural serving, rurally located as well, right? So I think to take a slightly different approach here, I think one of the challenges that I've really found in sort of my line of work is it's the specific issues that we've been talking about, yes, but I think that's also sort of the larger narrative conversation surrounding education and in particular schools. I think at least in my line of work, we've had this assumption that policymakers might have an idea of what need is out there in rural places and rural schools and rural communities, but it's simply not the case, right? It's very rarely the case that, they fully understand, the specific circumstances that a particular school is going to face in terms of fully providing for their students to have a completely holistic education that's open and accessible to everybody, that really sets them on a perfect either career or post-secondary pathway, right? And so the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools, for instance, recently just celebrated with their state partners for the establishment of a Rural Education Advisory Council within the Illinois State Legislature, which previously did not exist. There was no specified space within these sort of high-level conversations about how do we support rural schools focused on rural as a concept. And so instead, folks tend to rely on these fallbacks that, Rachel had mentioned about, oh, well, rural, it's going to be white, it's going to be aging, it's going to be leaning conservative, right? So if I'm the Illinois legislature, why should I pay attention, right? Or they're good enough, they're all farmers, they have money, right? And it's simply not the case. So I really think it comes back to, starting first, if we want to understand access in the rural space, what are the conversations we're having about rural people and places, right? Are we empathetically and genuinely listening to the teachers, the students, the families of those places first? And so I think, a concept of like this rural this rural advisory council, or even just encouraging your policymakers to listen to what teachers are saying, right? Rural Schools Collaborative, in my past life, ran a whole nationwide project called the Policy Playbooks Project, wherein they gathered 5 caucuses of rural educators in 5 distinct regions of the country to simply ask, what's your thought, right? And so many of them were blown away by the fact that there was somebody that cared enough about what they thought to ask about it and to jot it down and then to share it, right? And so I think, if we want to start pinpointing some specifics about where we want, policymakers and those sort of in the advocacy space to be thinking, let's start by talking. Let's start by asking, the teachers in the field. And I think going hand in hand with that, something that I haven't quite heard directly yet is the sense of belonging, right? In both of my positions now, we've had a pretty specific focus on educators and ensuring there's enough educators in the workforce. And time and again, what I hear from teachers is, it's not just ensuring that their voice is represented, that it's heard, but that they have this sense that they belong where they're at, right? And so it's easy if you're from a community, perhaps, to say, oh, this is my hometown where I came from. But there's simply not enough teachers from the hometown to fill up our schools, right? Then we need to do a lot of work to build up these education pathways. And both my organizations do that to a degree of inspiring and training high quality educators to go to rural communities. But really, I think the key in there is building up, the community and the institutional, the higher ed supports for, how do we foster that sense of rootedness, of belonging. I'm not going to claim to have the answer there. That's why it's a problem. But I do hear that time and again, and that's intimately connected with the teacher's overall resilience, their social emotional well-being. If the teacher doesn't feel like they belong, and they don't feel like they're supported, it's going to be even harder for them to support those kids in the classroom who are already relying on the teacher for extra educational support along a different line. So yeah, I think genuine conversations and then overall teacher belonging and community belonging and acceptance, I think are 2 issues that I've seen.
Yeah, thank you so much for articulating that and bringing in the perspective of educators. And I think that that's a really strong link to the racial equity that we talked about. We know that having educators of color is really impactful on the quality of education for children of color. And we also know that racial profiling, voter disenfranchisement, and other issues around racial equity can be particularly acute in rural communities where people are hyper visible when they might not match the demographics of the majority. So I think that bringing out those teacher belonging issues is very connected to that theme of racial equity. Thanks for articulating that. I'd love to turn now to our early childhood education specialist here. Anne, could you tell us what you think is the #1 challenge for educational equity from your perspective?
When I think about what's happening in the childcare and early learning landscape, and in particular, the way in which there are challenges that rural communities face, unique challenges or just particularly pervasive challenges, I think a lot about the need to increase the supply of high quality childcare. And what I mean by that is not just more programs. It's that there are a lot of things that go into what makes a thriving childcare system, and there are a lot of challenges that communities face right now. When I think about the supply of high quality childcare, I'm thinking about, yes, spots for children in the setting that their parents or their caregivers want. So that might be a home-based program, that might be a childcare center, that might be in a K-12 setting for an early learning or preschool program when they need it. So during hours and times that match up with what their parents or caregivers are looking for and that they can afford. And all of that goes into the question of whether or not there's enough supply. And the answer right now is that there's not, right? And that we have so many children across the country, so many families across the country that can't access childcare and early learning when they need it. And what also underlies that lack of supply is, of course, that communities, as they are struggling when it comes to recruiting and retaining educators at other level of education, they're struggling to recruit and retain educators to be a part of the early learning and childcare system. The financial model is incredibly hard, right? These are private businesses in our communities across the country receiving, in some cases, absolutely inadequate subsidy payments for eligible children and families, and having to rely on on the price that they set for families, for parents to pay, and often seeing downward pressure on that because families can't afford it. So I think all of those things conspire, and we see it show up in the stories we hear from families who can't find childcare when they need it, and communities that are saying, we've got to find a solution. We've got to find programs, homes, caregivers who can be a part of a childcare and early learning system. It's really interesting, Annie, that you brought up thinking about the resilience of our education systems in the context of disasters and emergencies. September is National Preparedness Month, and childcareprepare.org is a space that we host at Childcare Aware of America for childcare and early learning programs and the system that supports them, to think about preparing and setting themselves up to be resilient in the face of disasters and emergencies. We see that, especially with natural disasters, the loss of childcare programs can be insurmountable to fix, or take a long time, have a long tail following a disaster. And that domino effect on the community is very real and very tangible. I think those are things that a lot of communities are experiencing, but I think a lot about how, in particular in places and in rural communities where supply is already not meeting the need, that those are real issues that communities are grappling with.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm glad to know about that programming, and hope we can dig into it more together, because it, as you said, the issues compound with lack of availability, but also what I believe it was Heather was mentioning earlier about rural communities being on the vanguard of a lot of climate disasters. So not only is it harder for rural communities to respond in early childhood education systems to those disasters, but they're more likely to face them. So that's a really interesting space I hope we can dig into a little bit more. All right, Sherry, I would love to hear you tell us what you think is the number one educational equity challenge from your perspective, recognizing that you sort of span these spaces between early childhood education and K through 12 with your current governing board role. Please tell us what you think we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I hope you guys will be able to hear me. Everyone's faces keep going in and out because my internet connection is not stable. So I apologize in advance if my speaking breaks up. So from my background, I actually get to dabble across the whole education span of everyone who spoke. So I have a pretty significant sense, at least in the state of Arizona, and then the national spaces I've been able to be in, to plus one on all the things that have been said so far. When I think about the only thing that I feel like I could add, because everyone touched on a lot of the things that were rattling in my head to this question, but the one thing that I think is going to be the challenge for the long term with what happens with the individuals who we are trying to ask to come into this space to be the childcare providers, is to give my lived experience, which is to say in 2000, I came into being direct service assistant activity leader, making $6.75 an hour. It is now 2023, and I would say the average childcare position, at least in my community, is about $15 an hour, which is not a big advancement in that time span of 23 years. And the cost of living has increased. You can go make the same amount of money to take care of, taking care of a infant toddler classroom, you can go make the same amount of money working at Taco Bell or Walmart or some of these experiences. So it becomes a challenge to convince someone in high school, or even someone who came into the community college space wanting to explore early childhood education, to see the value and stay the course. So using myself as an example, though I stay, very well connected in the early childhood space in Arizona, I have maneuvered in the system because of my passion and commitment to children, not because I was willing to stay working in a childcare center, because it is not a livable wage. That is not something that any of us can address. It was absolutely acknowledged on this call, but is a significant variable because of the privatization of this sector of education. And I think that's probably at the root of what I'm hearing with my community college colleagues, with wanting to retain or recruit students into early childhood programming. From the rural space, the other thing that I would want to add is really being intentional about defining what rural America looks like. To give context, in Arizona, one of the things that has been brought to my awareness in this last year is the impact of our very rural spaces, such as our the areas that our tribal nations inhabit. The Navajo Nation, which is the largest tribe in Arizona, still has communities where individuals don't have running water or sewage. Broadband is a huge issue. This impacts the K-12 system. This impacts the higher ed system. So I appreciate that entering into this space, but really understanding what rural looks like is really critical to this conversation, and then gets woven into some of the political context that has kind of crept in a little bit into this conversation, but it's all very relevant to how the prioritization is designed for supporting just the system as a whole, regardless of community that you're looking at, but then very much so in the rural community across Arizona as well as across the country. Yeah, I don't know that there's so many things that have already been said, and just slicing and dicing this from multiple states' perspectives. The other thing that I might bring up would be the federal expectations. And the reason why I say that is, having worked in the Division of Childcare, a lot of our work in the subsidies is governed by the Office of Childcare. And I don't know, it's like a gift and a curse at the same time. And I think having that awareness of this need for money to pay for subsidies for families and for childcare providers is very rooted in this federal expectation of, at least if you have free time. I actually have a condensed version of the Child Care Development Block Grant Act, but it says, like, you need to do these criteria, and then essentially you get access to this money, which then feeds into your subsidies for families and for childcare providers who are contracted. And it's a fascinating box to some degree to have to live in. And within a state like Arizona, where you have all of these statewide partners who are having to really work together to kind of create this tapestry of the system, it makes it even more interesting. And I'm using interesting very facetiously, but there's just so many nuances and tensions and really good work that comes out of it. But all these things dramatically play into the supply and demand conversation when it comes to childcare. And then it just becomes more complex or complicated when you move into the language that we use in Arizona is our childcare deserts, which happen to be very, very concentrated in our rural communities. And it's like, how do you create the formula or try these concentrated efforts to get traction and helping to, make things better on behalf of children. The other thing that I didn't hear is family, friend, and neighbor. So I'm not sure what that looks like across the country. I worked at a nonprofit that has had a family, friend, and neighbor program for the last 20 or so years of its over 40-year existence. And that is by far the predominant, probably, childcare setting that we see in Arizona. Probably might be true for other states. However, as much as that is of value to the system, where this starts to fall apart is that school readiness piece, right? Like, are we helping children, from that high quality early learning perspective so that it supports the trajectory into the K-12 system, which then goes into the higher education system. So how do we support, families that really, as an end result, because they can't afford it or they can't find the space, is to have a grandma, a neighbor, an aunt, or whoever, care for their children. And then we, as the professionals, deal with the unintended consequences of that being, how people find care for their children.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And you just have such a depth and breadth of experience. I'm really grateful to have your expertise on this call and in this conversation. All right, I'm going to stop calling on people. I think for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'd really like to let you all kind of jump in where you want. And I'm going to mush the two conversations or the two questions I had together, which is to say, how do you all see these issues of access, of funding, of wages, each of those key pieces that you each brought up, how do you see them overlapping with the other levels of education? I've kind of grouped you into three buckets of early childhood education and childcare, K through 12, and higher education. Please feel free to push back on my buckets if you don't think those are right. And so what do you think are the overlaps in those issues? And where do you think the issues are distinct? That, the issue in childcare is very different from higher education. I want you all to have an open conversation, just be a little bit cognizant. I'm trying to, I want to be able to pull out a single person and their comments. So just trying not to talk over each other too much so that I can capture that and on the back end. But I would love to let you all talk openly.
I really appreciated hearing from several folks today about, I think something we know is true. So many people in our communities rely on childcare to be able to do the things that keep their families economically secure and power their futures. And that might mean being an educator in their own right. And so I heard when we were talking about our K-12 teachers, when we were talking about the folks who are working in our institutions of higher education, many of them are also parents and caregivers and are reliant and dependent on our early learning and childcare system to be able to then go be educators in those other spaces. I think that is such an interesting community challenge to think about then, how those things are interrelated because of some of the actual individual people who rely on these various systems to be their employer, to support their children, to be, any number of things. And so I think from a community standpoint, there's also a lot of power in that. It means that you can bring together your school system and your community college to talk about resourcing an early learning or a childcare program, or think about how you can add an employer benefit or resource for those families to use in a home-based setting or in their family childcare or center-based childcare program of choice. There are some connection points there, but it also means that when something isn't working, all of our systems in our programs struggle. So when we don't have childcare, we maybe struggle to also have teachers in our schools or at our colleges. Mm-hmm. I think that's just such a true factor of communities, but I heard it in everyone's comments in this conversation today.
And I have to really echo what you were saying there, because even outside of education, when students want to stay in their community, graduates want to stay, work, and we know that there's this ecosystem that works well when people can get jobs, live where they want to live, and raise their family near family, which in a lot of rural communities, that's a terrific value. Their grandparents and aunts and uncles, and there's a family support. I think beyond childcare, the other thing is employers in rural communities need to value parents, because if your child is in a daycare or at school and they have a fever, all of a sudden you're getting a call, and And so if we want to increase equity, we also have to start valuing those who are caring for children, whether they're in pre-K or 8th grade or whatever level. So I think it goes beyond that it's really supporting, our workers as well, so that they can, remain in these communities and strengthen the communities, grow them so that you have more equity, more diversity, more opportunities. And I think, as someone else had mentioned, I don't know, I think it was Heather was talking about or John, I apologize, finding quality teachers. There's not enough in one community, to run a school district. You have to recruit and you have to invite others to come into your community. So there has to be that sense of welcoming and connection. And that, I think, is where some of the other capitals do come in, the human capital, just political capital, making sure that there are opportunities, that no one feels like they are the other. And so that, I think, is more intuitive in rural communities, that we need to make sure that we are getting that information, putting that forward. I'm not sure making myself really clear. I know what I'm thinking, but I know it's not, the words are not coming. But I do think we spent a lot on childcare, because obviously that impacts every level in the community, but it also has to go the inverse. We have to value our aging. We have to, they have so much to offer. And that's another equity piece, not so much in education, but they can be a terrific resource for education. The grandparent in the classroom, the grandparent at a child care center. So maybe we also need to find ways to encourage that level of involvement from other community members as a resource. Just a thought.
I think I agree completely. And I think that two things that I pulled away from what you talked about, one is the need, across all sectors of education to kind of prove the value, right, is a challenge that I think all sectors of education share in different ways. But on the flip side of that, or not the flip side maybe, but the other thing that I think, you kind of touched on a theme a lot of is how the strength that rural communities have in that community base and in the ability to collaborate and work together. And I think that that's really critical in solving some of these challenges. Community colleges in rural places, I'm sure some K-12 schools and early childhood centers also, I'm most familiar with community colleges, but we kind of talk about the way that community colleges in rural places are used to being all things for all people, right? They're like places to gather, places to vote. It's, maybe the largest food pantry in the community, somewhere to get mental health resources. And I think that any kind of, community schools, community colleges can be those hubs if they have the resources, right? And I don't want to harp on funding again, but I think, there's a couple of different quick things I would just say about that. One is, as it relates to childcare in particular, there's a great federal funding program, C-Campus. Childcare access means parents in school is the acronym. That's really underutilized. So few colleges take advantage of it. And they have the opportunity to provide childcare centers, not just for students, but for the entire community. They have the option to open it up. But of course, federal funding can be really difficult to access. And so I just wanted to mention one quick kind of case study that I love of Hazard Community College, Community and Technical College, I think in Kentucky, has done some really incredible work, kind of touching on all points of this, to Dr. Lovelace's point as well about, aging members of the community, adult learners. They have kind of this childcare segment. And so Hazard has a program called Tuesday Night Live. So students can take courses that are partially virtual, which we know is, broadband issues, but I won't get into that. And then just one night a week, they come in person for classes. And that one night a week when they come, it's after work hours. So if they're working full time, they can come do their classes at night. Dinner is provided and childcare is provided. And so while the parents are in class, if they have, the learners are in class, if they have children, their children have childcare opportunities And that childcare is provided by other students at the college who are in early childhood programs. So they kind of have this like really cool wraparound community model. The students that go through the program have much higher retention rates than in other programming that they have. You know, the people that are in the early childhood programs get that practicum, hands-on experience. And then you get a meal and you get to have kind of that community interaction. They bring in people from the community to talk about different programming and different things that are available. And so I just wanted to bring that up as one kind of really cool, you know, we can talk about funding until we're blue in the face, but sometimes when it's at the federal or state level, it's hard to get at, right? And so, you know, what kind of cost-effective solutions can we dream up within our own communities while we're filling out federal grant paperwork or, you know, waiting on the legislature to make the right call?
I want to make sure we don't miss that Sherry had a comment to jump in with.
Oh, you know, it's so funny. Like I can tell we all have been doing this work because my brain is in sync with the things that are being said. So even though I wasn't quick to get to the unmute button, it's to some degree what I was going to say has already been said. But I just wanted to lift up the business sector, right, and really making a case for the economic impact. But the extra that I would add on to that is actually not only inviting them to participate at the table, but helping them to understand it, not only from our lens, but really understand it from their perspective as well, and being intentional about that process. Because I think oftentimes when some brave person does include some business person or politician, if you will, in the conversation, we expect them to make the connection because everybody cares about kids, right? Like there's this like, you want to see kids have safe, you know, high quality care experiences. So you get it and you can open the doors and get money and make policy changes and things of that nature. And that is just not true. And that's a really dangerous pathway to go in terms of making assumptions that just because people care that they will get it from our perspective. And then the other thing that I would add is bringing childcare providers into the conversation. I don't know necessarily the background of everyone on this call if you've ever been a direct care service provider. And I will just speak from someone who did it 20 years ago. It is a different experience for the 19-year-old, the 18-year-old who just graduated high school, trying to figure out what do I want to be when I grow up, which I am still doing in my mid 40s. But for sure, Gen Z is a completely different, you know, generation that looks at work and how they are valued. And all of those things are really, really critical. And then I don't want to miss the family childcare sector. They often really are pushed to the background when it comes to having a voice. So being very intentional about getting, you know, childcare provider voice baked into these discussions, because I don't live in that space on a day-to-day basis. And though I can speak to many, many years of seeing that across Arizona's, all of Arizona, and people that I've gotten to engage with who are childcare providers from a national level at like NAEYC's annual conference. I've met many, many wonderful childcare providers, but often I don't see them in these spaces when people are saying, how do we fix this problem? We got to go to the people who are living the day-to-day experience in the problem.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I love all that. I think it's bringing folks to the table, right? I mean, I think, you know, one of the things I love about working in the rural sector, you know, and it doesn't matter if you're rural, urban, suburban, you know, the name of the game is collaboration, right? Let's bring people to the table. But one of the things I've loved about coming from, growing up in, and now working in a rural space is that collaboration seems so possible because you know the people who are there, you know you know the business down the street, you know the child care provider, you know the school district. And so I think really just emphasizing that there's a huge amount of assets in our places already, really tapping them to join the table in an authentic, genuine way, I think really will lead the path toward at least finding some locally baked solutions to these problems, right? Like at the end of the day, funding is necessary. And the truth of it is not everybody has the capacity to reach for that state or federal funding, right? And so going back to like what Rachel was saying, there's a lot that can be done right now locally using the folks in the, you know, the ecological environment, the businesses, et cetera. But just bringing them to the table and talking about it. So it's all things everybody said, but I loved it so much. I resonated with it. So I just wanted to rehash it once more. But, you know, I think it goes back to the conversation a little bit as well that, you know, people would want to live in a rural place, right? Like there's some folks who the city life is for them. That's 100% true. I say go for it. But it's somewhat a myth to say that people don't like rural areas, right? What they don't like is the concept of moving to a place that is perceived as dying, has nothing, and is not for you, right? Which simply isn't the case, because there's families that are living and thriving in rural places already. And so what it takes is recognizing our assets of all the different capitals that the florist talked about earlier, bringing them to the table, having that conversation. Anyway, I could go on.
I want to summarize a couple of the policy ideas that I'm hearing emerge from what you all are talking about. I'm hearing that we need policies that make funding, state and federal funding, more accessible to people in education at every level. I'm hearing that we need policies that are structured in a way that bring more direct service providers and educators to the table to help build the policy. So maybe that has to do with rulemaking processes or you know, some sort of participatory requirements in the programs as they're developed. And there was, I'm sorry, I had a third one that I was pulling out of what you all were saying, and I've lost my train of thought. But I want to encourage us to use these last couple of minutes to think about what are those specific policies that either are common among the different levels of education, policy goals, and what might be. It's okay to share something if it's distinct, but that's what I'd really love for us to tease out when we look into policy advocacy at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. What should we be fighting for? What are the things we need to ask our elected officials and our agency administrators to do for us in education?
I'm gonna jump in here because you're rubbing a tension point for me with our healthcare licensing requirements. So in Arizona, these my brain is like fracturing right now. I think it's just been a long day. The regulatory guidelines in Arizona are dictated by our legislature. And one of the things that when experts come to the table to talk about the concerns and the areas of need, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, basically, of our system, we often just kind of dismiss our Department of Health Services because our licensing standards are rooted in politics, essentially. And it's very frustrating to know that we all know that you need to do more than pass a background check, essentially, and be breathing. But that is kind of the baseline. And many of our childcare programs basically stay in that neck of the woods when it comes about being able to deliver quality. It's problematic. It gets in the way of being able to make these advances, because as long as these regulations are controlled, if you will, by politicians, right, who see childcare, kindergarten as a nice to have, not a need to have, it just delays this evolution to ultimately happen that stretches across all constituencies. So I don't know how helpful that is. It's such a rubbing point for me. And I have many colleagues who work for childcare licensing that are wonderful people, and they understand everything that we're talking about, but it's almost like their hands are tied, right? They can't really do anything or have higher expectations other than making sure that people are meeting the bare minimums that have been set by the state. And that is extremely problematic in a conversation like this. It's a breaking point or a tension point.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that tension point. And I'm curious if you have thoughts. You mentioned a few specific policy goals when you were sharing earlier around, paying providers at the level of the cost that it takes to provide care. You talked about some of the other pieces around accessing the Child Care and Development Block Grant. And Sherry, I know you talked a little bit about that as well. What are some of, I'm hearing you, Sherry, and I, that, treating early childhood education in kindergarten as essential and not optional would be a policy shift. What are some of those other things we'd like to see a shift in how we talk about and think about education?
Yeah, I think that shift is a really important one. Childcare and early learning and communities having access to the kind of childcare they need when they need it at a price they can afford it, that's high quality and helps nurture children. I think that is a shift, and I think that can happen at a lot of levels. That can be a local commitment, it can be a statewide commitment, it can be a federal commitment. And one of the things I would name is that we've seen how to do better by our child care and early learning system. We have about $25 billion of grants directly to child care programs over the past 2 years as a part of the relief funding. And while that still has not solved some of the underlying issues, like the way we set rates for childcare subsidy and the fact that that builds in or assumes these terrible wages for our educators. We can do more of what works. We can think about supply building and startup grants, the kind of foundational or steady funding for childcare and early learning through contracts and grants that can make a difference for a business to thrive, a childcare business. Because at the end of the day, a really important thing to keep in mind is that the childcare and early learning system is filled with both for-profit and not-for-profit businesses. It's a private market that we provide resources to. And part of what that allows us to do is to meet parents' needs, to be in their actual individual communities, their neighbor's home or a center that's near where they live, in addition to potentially in a city center, in a workplace, at a place where people gather, in a public school. All of those things become possible through a system that supports thriving childcare and early learning businesses, but we really have to commit the kind of resources that can make that possible, because the existing margins for those businesses are too narrow. Those businesses are very vulnerable, and when we don't have that commitment or that buy-in that we consider this a priority, we see that it can be untenable to survive and to recruit and retain educators and to provide high quality childcare and early learning. We're really excited though about the way that economic and community development can play a role here too. And that's something that from a community standpoint can be really useful. It can leverage public resources, but it can also direct them to the kind of high need that childcare and early learning programs have. So there are some opportunities there too that flow from that prioritization we're talking about.
How about in the higher education space? I heard access, which is very broad and has tendrils into a bunch of different spaces. What are some of the other policy goals we should be thinking about that apply to higher ed and may also trickle into the other milestones of education?
I think there are two things that come to mind for me right away. One is kind of like broader and more conceptual, and maybe not as directly applicable in policy, but I think just a reframing, kind of related to what Sherry was talking about, just making sure in all of these policy conversations that we have the right people at the table. Throughout history and continuing on today, I think the Biden administration has made a lot of changes and really reemphasized rural communities, but I think that we still see so many instances where the communities that are being impacted by policy are not included in the conversation. And we have to stop doing that. we just need to stop doing that if we're going to make positive change in our rural communities. We have to have rural people at the table, empowered in decision making, given agency in how policy is created. And the more kind of concrete thing I would say is, sort of specific, is that at the federal level, the Department of Education has an Office of Rural Education It is housed under the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. So there is no direct work being done at the federal level for post-secondary rural education. So I think that that is something that needs to change. And I think as that work hopefully expands, that the department will think about ways to promote flexibility in what it means to be rural and how they fund and support rural communities. So we've already seen some new initiatives and funding come out directly targeted at rural post-secondary institutions. And we work with, at Research Ed, with a number of institutions that were ostensibly eligible, but due to the nature of federal grants and in particular the way that these ones were rolled out, they were not even able to apply. Like, they took one look at it and just shut the browser. And so I think I would love to see a greater commitment to rural post-secondary education at the federal level, and an understanding that in doing that, we need to be flexible in thinking about the needs of these communities and how to realistically support them. And I think that ties back to like having that voice in the room. Like if they had consulted a single rural post-secondary institution before putting that grant posting up, I think it could have looked very different.
I have to echo what Rachel has just said, is having the right people at the table make all the difference. And not only at the federal level, but state levels. If you're going to be making policy about a rural community, somebody from the community should be there. They should be invited. They shouldn't have to mind read and say, oh, you know what, maybe I need to do this. And that happened, that even the local level, there were so many dollars over the last 3.5 years given to local communities, rural communities. But I heard this repeatedly. Many of those rural communities and the leaders didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to utilize it. And some of them were worried that if they made a mistake, they would be penalized severely. So, sometimes this is where financial capital may not always be the answer, throwing money at the problem, but you have to have other resources. You have to provide people who are willing to say, okay, let us help you set up how to allocate these funds from COVID, how to seek a grant to improve your community. I can speak for my own little community. There's so many things that need to be done, and there are grant funds out there, but there's not always the people at the table who understand that or understand how to use them. And so having people at all levels, from local to federal, who have, and in some cases, this is where I, have to agree with Sherry, they've walked the walk, so, having known what it's like to be a child care worker, she certainly has that expertise and that authenticity. Having worked in education, I have seen that in my 35 years, very little has changed. If I look back from all my time, we're still talking about a lot of the same issues, and very few people who have truly been impacted have been engaged in the conversation at the start. And I think that's something on the policy, the federal level, any policy really is, nothing should go forward unless, I don't know, make up a number, 5 people from any rural area has read it or something, because oftentimes that's when you realize, I think for rural cities and communities, you start to feel that you don't have any value, and that's a terrible thing. So, I just have to say, if somebody at the state level made a decision to cut down all the trees and kill all the bushes and grass along a state highway in front of our town, and it is the saddest thing I've ever seen. It looks like a wasteland, and it was a beautiful barrier for all the noise, and it was all green. And so somebody made that decision, and I can't believe anybody in this town was asked. So that happens in all walks of life. So I have to agree with what Rachel just shared.
Rural representation is I think a great policy position to think about as we start to think about putting together something to collaborate on and to consolidate rural educational voices around. I like that idea. Okay, I would like to give Dr. Jan Flora, a chance to reflect on what you've heard through the community capital lens, just maybe for 2 minutes. And then I'd like us to wrap up. And I'm going to ask you to be as succinct as you can. If you were going to write something on a policy platform today, like you got to put one thing on there to say, we need to fight for this. I'm going to ask you to just sum it up in 30 seconds. What would it be? But first, I'm going to ask Dr. Jan Flora, what have you heard from this group today, and how does it relate to that framework that you and your spouse and colleague have spent so much energy creating as a framework for thinking about rural thriving?
I think probably the most important thing that I heard was the whole idea of collaboration and allowing people who are going to be affected by policies to actually have a role in shaping those policies. And one of the things I was reminded of as people were talking is I guess it sort of leads us into the realm of political capital as well as human capital, and that is in Iowa, which, as you may know, has become a red state. This past year we had a law passed that allowed for vouchers to go to to go to private schools, and we had a program like that before, but it was much smaller. And so now it's taking a significant share of the public school budget, educational budget, and our public educational system is suffering. And what I thought was particularly interesting was that our governor had pushed for this for several years, but simply hadn't been able to get sufficient votes. So in 2022, those rural legislators, all of whom were Republicans, who voted against expanding the voucher program, had people run against them from the right in the primary, and several of them ended up losing their positions. And I was just listening to a school superintendent in a rural area talking about it on our public television talk show, and he said, "Well, my community did not have any loss of students from the public sector, but it was still a problem for us because it reduces the total amount of funding that there was for the public schools." So here was an instance where at the state level there was simply an unwillingness, even more than that, a conscious effort to reduce the ability of rural representatives to have their say. So I think that, to me, that, and of course, as you were talking about early childhood education, certainly some of that money that went to the vouchers could have gone to strengthening our early childhood program. Iowa has a program for 3 and 4 year olds through the public school system, but it's significantly underfunded, and it's not at all universal.
Wow.
So those
Yeah,
were some of the things that I thought of.
thank you so much. All right. Well, we've reached our time. I would like to have, if you have it, if you've prepared it, your 30 seconds or less, even one line, what should be on a rural agenda? And you're not going to be held to this. We're gonna keep working through it. But if you had to do it today, what would your one policy goal be to add to a rural education policy agenda? Can I start with Sherry?
So my original answer, I don't know that it aligns with the reframing of what you said, but I'll say it. It's not going to be a popular one, which is to put pressure on the expectations, like the regulatory expectations. So it's like increase the connectedness to high quality early learning experiences, right? So what I'm essentially saying is that the system drive this, because the privatization is causing us to kick the can, essentially. And that has gotten significant pushback in Arizona, but Head Start was successful. And I know there's, not all good things with Head Start, but for the most part, this started in the 60s, and this is a federally funded program. And the Department of Defense, same thing, increase the expectations. And I just think we've just got to pressure test it and get people to meet the new expectation and figure out the rest of it. And the feds can fund it or supplement it.
I love it. Anne had to leave us. Let's hear from John in the K through 12 space. What would your one-liner be for a policy agenda for rural education?
All right, my one-liner here. Pay teachers more. Can't say it enough. It has to be said. Educators at all levels. And I think it's also supporting teacher and student social emotional health wellness in every possible way. I can't express that enough. And then lastly, really finding ways to support cradle to career pathways for students that are meaningful, engaging, and empowering, to lead them on to career, college, whatever comes after, but really supporting them from day one, clear up until they make their path out. And it's more than just pushing money and resources at it. I think, the grounding for it all is that we need to redefine community development to not mean putting another industry or building another Walmart in my town, but also supporting the institutions of public support, like the schools that are already there. And really seeing the school as the hub for community growth. So that's my soapbox.
Thank you, John. Rachel, what do you think? What's your one-liner?
Yeah, I think, well, I had one and then I want to tie into what John said also, but I'll be really quick. I think in the post-secondary space, we need a rural serving institution designation, similar to the specialized mission institution designations that we have for lots of other, minority serving institutions. Would love to see that. And I also think that, kind of more broadly to John's point, I think really reframing education as more than just a means to an end. It's not just, as all these conversations happen about value and defunding public education in K-12 spaces and questioning the value overall of post-secondary education, while of course we want to promote social and economic mobility and improved well-being of people, and we know that education can be a path to do that and to better careers and higher paying jobs, like that should not be the sole focus of why we talk about the value of education. Education, is a way to create civically engaged, intellectually curious, people who have the tools that they need to participate in our society and collaborate and work together and, pursue their interests. And so, that would be my other kind of thing, just reframing how we think about the value of education and creating RSIs.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lovelace, will you round us out?
Sure, I'm going to give you a brief statement and I love what everyone has said, but any policy maker making a rural policy has to live it for 30 days. It's the only way they'll change some of the things they do.
Well, I really appreciate the extra 6 minutes beyond what I asked for, so that we could really try to kind of distill this conversation into some of those big ideas that we can pursue. As I said, I'm not going to hold you all to that as like the thing that goes on the agenda, but I do think it's a great starting place for us to start vetting those ideas with people in rural communities and get feedback from them, which is one of the next steps we're going to take, is to get some feedback from our network of about 100,000 people living in rural communities across the country and say, what did we miss? Which of these should be number one? And I will come back to you all with all of the products and all of the feedback so that we can keep enriching this conversation. I'm so appreciative to all of you. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll be in touch with you all very soon.
Thanks, Annie. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.